Jesus' crucifixion by Pontius Pilate in the Roman Empire was arguably the single most important historical event in all of Western civilization. It was also one of the most brutal. But Jesus' execution at the hands of Rome was not unique for the empire. Remember, Rome was born in blood, and conquered and maintained their empire in large part through cruelty. But hundreds of years later, after undeniably executing Jesus, the Romans themselves became Christians. This put the Romans in a bit of a religious psychological dilemma. They were now Christians, and historically, they had killed Jesus. They had killed God. Not only killed him, but brutally tortured and executed him. Now, we study history to learn about ourselves and about human nature. So what do human beings tend to do when they've done something wrong, especially something horrifically wrong like execute an innocent person, or worse yet, a man you believe was God on earth? Why, we blame someone else, of course. It wasn't my fault, it was their fault. They made me do it. They told me to do it. You've experienced this possibly many times in your life. Why are you struggling in sports, in academics, or in life in general? Why, it's your coach's fault. Your teacher's fault. Your parents' fault. Heck, it's the president's fault. We like to point the finger at anyone except for ourselves. This human tendency is called finding a scapegoat. The ancient Hebrews used to cast out a goat into the desert, which bore all the sins of the people. This practice caught on, and we still scapegoat today. We just blame people and not goats. Bad goat. So back to the Romans. Hundreds of years after executing Jesus, they've become Christians. How are they going to deal with the fact that they executed their God? Oh, but wait, it's much worse than this. The Romans had much more to feel guilty about than just killing Jesus. Heck, that was just the tip of the iceberg. Let me explain. Oh, but did they ever execute Jesus? How? By crucifying him. Crucifixion was a fairly unique Roman preferred method of executing undesirables. It was a messy, painful, and very public, and was an effective way of warning against others to not mess with the empire. In the case of Jesus, he was beaten nearly to death by Roman soldiers and whipped unmercifully. The whip used is often referred to as the cat of nine tails, which is made from straps of rope or leather with knots tied or chunks of metal, bone, or pottery embedded at the ends. To further mock his claims as King of Kings, the Romans forced a crown of thorns onto Jesus' head. Stripped down and possibly naked, bleeding profusely, Jesus was made to carry the horizontal crosspiece of his cross to his point of execution. This was a walk of most estimate to be about half a mile. Once at the spot of his crucifixion, Jesus was then nailed to the cross. Most times the Romans tied the victim to the cross, but for high-profile executions, like a claimed Messiah, the Romans used nails. The Gospels say that Jesus was nailed in his hands and feet. Jesus is often depicted as being nailed in the palms. Most likely, though, Jesus was nailed through his wrists, and in the days of Rome, the wrist was thought of as part of the hand. Then Jesus was erected on the cross. One Gospel has the sign King of the Jews above Jesus, a further insult by the Romans. Another Gospel has the inscription INRI, which is a Latin acronym for Jesus Nazarene Rex Israel, or Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Now on the cross, Jesus would have experienced the true horror of his execution. In order to breathe on the cross, the victim must raise themselves up off of the cross. So Jesus would have had to have pushed up on the nail in his feet in order to breathe. The pain would have been excruciating. Many who were crucified could only do this for a maximum of a couple of days before their muscles cramped and collapsed, and they would then suffocate on the cross and die. And then the birds would come and pick over their remains. Jesus died fairly quickly, undoubtedly because of the intense beatings he had suffered prior to his crucifixion. This is what the Romans did, and now as Christians, what they had to feel guilty for. But the Roman persecution of Christians went on and on, and on, and on, and on, and on. A Jew named Saul, better known by his Christian name Paul, assured that Christianity would become a great faith. Paul traveled endlessly in the Eastern Empire, spreading the words of Jesus, and starting and guiding new Christian communities. Paul's letters are in the New Testament of the Bible, and are known as the epistles, or letters of Paul. Paul was so successful, he is known as the co-founder of Christianity. Well, Paul eventually came to the city of Rome, capital of the Roman Empire, to spread the teachings of Jesus. But the Roman Empire had had enough of Paul's efforts, and he was beheaded in Rome by Roman authorities. So it's Roman Empire 2, Christian 0. So they killed God, and now they killed Paul. Oh boy. But for the Romans, their persecution of Christians continues. Emperor Nero, who was Caesar in Rome when Paul was beheaded, also blamed the Christians for the massive fire that destroyed much of Rome in 64 CE. Nero was probably trying to deflect suspicion that he had set the fire himself, and fiddled while the city burned. He blamed the Christians, who most Romans knew next to nothing about. It was also during this time that horrible rumors were spread about this new Christian faith. Many of these rumors had a hint of truth to them, but were horribly exaggerated. Christians refused to worship the emperor, and also would not serve in the Roman armies. Something about no other gods and thou shalt not kill. It was also said that Christians met secretly, where they ate flesh and drank blood, and even kissed their brothers and sisters. This was easily explained away by the bread and wine of communion and worshippers giving each other the sign of or kiss of peace. But no matter. Nero wanted to blame someone for the fire, and Christians were just too easy. So throw them all to the lions. For the next 250 years, Christians were sporadically hunted down, rounded up, and killed. Many died courageously as martyrs, those who die for their faith. They died willingly for Jesus, believing that their reward would be in heaven. It was the immense courage of generations of Christian peoples that eventually won over the Romans. The Romans wouldn't die for their gods, Jupiter and Neptune, but many Christians feared nothing, including death, because of the strength and courage they got from worshiping Jesus. And so, Constantine the Great and later Roman emperors legalized Christianity, and it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. The old pagan temples to the old gods were destroyed and taken down, and churches built in their place. Rome had killed Jesus, but Jesus in the end conquered the Roman Empire. Christianity ruled. And so now the Romans were Christians. But we come back to the original question. How did the Romans, who now were Christians, deal with the fact that they historically had brutally executed Jesus and then had tortured and killed Christians for hundreds and hundreds of years? Why, they found a scapegoat. The Romans read the Gospels, and particularly the Gospel of Matthew, and they blamed the Jews for the death of Jesus. Now understand, Jesus himself was a Jew. So was Moses. So was Joshua. Samson, of Samson and Delilah fame. David and Goliath. All of these guys were Jews. Including Adam Sandler. He's Jewish too. Well, how did the Roman Empire blame the Jews? Well, in the Gospels, the story is that the Roman governor of Jerusalem, at the time of Jesus' death, was a man by the name of Pontius Pilate. And according to the Gospels, he offered the crowded marketplace a choice of who should die. It was the Passover holiday, and Pilate said, because of Passover, this great Jewish holiday, I will allow the crowd to pick someone to go free. I'll allow them to pick a prisoner to go free. The choices, the Gospels say, were Jesus and a murderer by the name of Barabbas. The crowd chose Jesus to die and Barabbas to go free. Pilate was stunned according to the Gospels. So stunned that he washed his hands in a basin and told the crowd that Jesus' death was not on him, but on the crowd who had chosen him to die. According to the Gospel of Matthew, the crowd shouted out as one, "May his blood be on us and on our children. Now, certainly most of the people in the crowd were Jews. When the Romans became Christians themselves hundreds of years later, after hundreds of years of persecuting Christians, they will seize on this line from the Gospels and say, See, it wasn't us that killed Jesus. It was the Jews. And reading the quote literally, they would say, blame the Jews and blame their children. Blame them forever for the death of Jesus. The Roman propaganda on blaming the Jews worked so well that many people today would still say that the Jewish people killed Jesus. This will eventually have far-reaching and terrible consequences for the Jewish people. So ironically, the Romans killed Jesus. They killed Paul. They killed Peter, who we haven't even talked about yet. They killed Christians for hundreds of years. They feed them to lions. They crucified them by the dozens. They would light them on fire. And then, after becoming Christians themselves, they would blame Jesus' own people, the Jews, for what they themselves did. The Romans, like all people, use scapegoats, including yourself. And all people that do use scapegoats need to take a deep breath, look in a mirror, and realize that the only blame that needs to be cast is staring back at them. In your life, accept responsibility for your mistakes. Apologize. Ask for forgiveness. Try to make amends. And then move on with your life. It's what Jesus would tell you to do. Do you hear that, Roman Empire? Do you hear that? This is your conscience calling. Perhaps you would like to make a few amends.